That's what matters, right? We're good? We're good to start? All right, perfect. So first of all, thanks for everyone coming. Welcome to the Microsoft Reactor Space. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my thoughts and experiences and best practices that I think are relevant for developer relations in Israel. Before I get started, it's really important to note that everything I say today, this is my own opinions. I'm going to say a couple things that I'm sure are controversial, that some people are going to disagree with, but I think they're important to be said, and it's important for us to have the conversation around them. And I look forward to the Q&A section of it. I also really love this. To me, this is like the definitive, for me, Israel. All right, good, I'm glad. So just before I get started, just a little bit about myself. I promise I'll keep it short. My name is Bornstein. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft on the developer relations team, technical developer relations team at Microsoft. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're open source engineers. We develop open source content. We work with communities within the startup nation. We develop this content, and we try to scale that content to have global reach and global impact. So we do all sorts of types of events and iruim, but everything is centered around the content and things we do. And we're going to dive into a little bit from my experiences in this current role, in the previous role doing open source engineering and collaborations with startups in Israel, and prior to that working in New York City and doing 2 years of DevRel, what we call DevRel now, that was called evangelism back then, and talking about some of those experiences. And when we get to start, we should take a step back and we should ask ourselves, what is DevRel? Well, the important thing to note about DevRel is without developer engagement, platforms fail. And I really love this slide that we put together here because it shows it doesn't matter which company you are, whether you're an Amazon, whether you're Nintendo, Google, Microsoft, whether you're Apple, whether you're even Sega or companies that are less relevant today like BlackBerry. The reality is without developers engaging with your products and your ecosystem, these ecosystem products fail. And the reason that matters is when lots of platforms fail, entire ecosystems fail. Who here knows, get one laugh, who here gets the reference of this? I want to see how nerdy the crowd is. Who is that? E.T., what's the story here, Sapir? Area. And what happened then? After this was a game for the Atari 2600. Prior to that, you had these great games, Space Invader and Pong. This game single-handedly killed not only the Atari platform, but killed video games for almost a 10-year period until they were revived by Nintendo. So it's really important when we're thinking about platforms and ecosystems, and also each of our own individual responsibilities as in DevRel, and in our own companies, that everything we do impacts one another. It's really important to remember that, that we don't want our ecosystems to fail, especially our ecosystem, because our ecosystem is a very diverse, very unique ecosystem, and our entire country's economy is dependent on the tech ecosystem here in Israel. So I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you guys are thinking exactly what's written here. That's great, but why do we need a consistent standard for developer relations? Well, the reason is that there are many roles that entail engaging developer audiences. There's the audience managers, the business development managers, the community managers, the solution architect, content developer, professional speaker, the black belt, the guru, the evangelist, the consultant, the CTOs, and the thought leaders, right? But the reality is that these alone are not DevRel. And I really like this. I added this slide 5 minutes ago because it was brought up earlier. I think pizza and beer are important. You need those types of things at your events. You need to engage the community and provide value to the community. But pizza and beer alone are not enough. Because at the end of the day, developers will come to your spaces, whether you're in Amazon, whether you're Google, whether you're Saluta, whether you're an AppsFlyer or a startup or a Microsoft, and they'll eat your pizza and they'll drink your beer. But at the end of the day, they're going to be doing it while wearing the swag of your competition. And it doesn't matter. Like if I'm at floor 28, I'm going to show up in my Microsoft wear. We have somebody here in Ignite wear, right? We have another person in Red Hat. And again, that's perfect because we're part of an ecosystem. But the reality is if you want a successful platform, you can't buy love. It's got to be more than just love. So, okay, again, that's great. But then what's DevRel? How many people get this reference? Am I getting old or? Good, all right. So DevRel is about being an ecosystem catalyst. What do we mean by ecosystem catalyst? It means that we need to serve the needs of developers through three things: content, community, and technical engineering. You guys can take a picture of that. And that's a nice quote, again, but let's dig into what that really means. We're going to break it down. So let's first talk about community. So when we think about community, and I think about community in terms of the roles of developer relations, there's a key cycle here. One is how I engage with the community, whether I'm speaking to developers, whether I'm showing up in a meetup as an attendee and sitting in the background trying to engage, whether I'm engaging online or off. The first aspect is to be part of a community, be part of the audience, speak to the developers. The second aspect of it, as we were talking about, is develop content. And we'll dig more into that in a second. From developing content, we get the feedback based on our content, and the community loop continues as we grow our ecosystem and our platform as we engage, right? And it's really important when we think about community, and this goes back to how you can't buy love, is that developer advocates are not blue shirts. Who here knows what a blue shirt is? All right, Adi, you don't count, I told you earlier. It's not even just tech support, right? So at Best Buy, who here knows tech, like Geek Squad, true, but actually separate than Geek Squad. How many people here have been to the United States? Oh, most of you, right? How many people have walked into a Best Buy? How many people walked into a Best Buy about 10 years ago? All right. 10 years ago, you used to have people who dressed up like this, and they're called blue shirts. And again, I'm not disparaging. It sounds like it, but I promise I'm not. I'm just saying we are differentiating. And what was the challenge with that? You'd come in, and you'd be the technical savvy person you are. You're trying to buy a new computer or a new part, and somebody would come up to you, and they would say, hey, have you heard about this? Have you heard about that? They would start talking to you. They might even talk down to you about not realizing that maybe you know more than them. Maybe you don't know more than them. How do you engage? How do you measure that, right? At the end of the day, when our job isn't to go and be, these cheerleaders and in front of the developers in that way as a blue shirt. Rather, our job is to engage, unblock, and enable the developer community. And for me, a big part of this comes to technical talks, for example. So for instance, all the time I get requests to come speak at conferences or to talk or to submit a CFP. And I tell people there are three things that I put as a developer advocate, my price for any technical talk I'm going to give. And now, you're going to see part of them in this talk, but the three things are this. Number one is a reusable presentation. And the presentation isn't necessarily, it doesn't mean reusable just by me. It means that if I give up and I give this presentation, by the end of this talk, I want to be able to have this presentation on SlideShare. And if somebody else, like Shir, wants to give this presentation because it's relevant to her, she can take the slides and integrate it into her talk. One of the challenges I see a lot in the developer relations community, developer advocacy community, is that we start building this mythos around ourselves in the presentations we give, and we attach personal value to the content we're developing rather than the audience or the community we're trying to address. So I'll give you an example. Like a couple months ago, I was asked to fly to Morocco for a developer conference. Now, it would have been fun. It would have flown me business to Morocco. I would get up on the stage. I'd give an amazing talk. People would love the talk. The entire team would talk about how they're flying in some guy, technical guy who's an expert in AI, machine learning, with a master's in NLP from Israel. It would be a big thing. But the challenge there, the reason I didn't do it, is for that specific talk, what happens when I get off the stage? What happens when I'm done with the deck? Instead, what I did is I had a local talk in Israel that I gave, that I bundled up, and instead of me giving the talk, I realized we have, as a company, many people who are in Microsoft in Morocco, right? So I can sit with them, and I can walk them through my content, and I can scale that way. And the reality is, again, that's different for different companies and different size companies. But the big aspect of it, and the first thing is recognizing any content I develop, it's not about me. So what I try not to do is when I try, sometimes I'll do it depending on it, but I try not to have one deck that I just repeat and give at every single meetup, at every single event. I want my content to be in such a way that if the content speaks for itself, other people will take the content and act like it's theirs. And then for me, I'm already working on the next idea. The second aspect and the second price I put on any technical content or any technical talk that I give is it needs to be linked to open source code, an open source repo. Because it's not enough that I just give this presentation. When I walk off the stage, I want to make sure that the developer audience, that when they go and they engage, that there's already code that they can get started with, that they can integrate it into their application, that somebody who's searching online already has this content and it exists. And I'll give some examples of that in a second. And the last aspect of it is the online content aspect. I want to make sure that the content that I'm developing in the open source, I can't support everything, but I want to make it as ironclad as possible. Because the reality is, with all due respect to the confidence aspect of it, and I think the confidence aspect is important, but it's also, when we think about the actual ecosystem, it can be a double-edged sword. Because I can speak confidently about something that I don't know much about. Somebody will engage with my technology, engage with my product, whether that's Azure in the cloud, whether that's AWS, whether that's GCP. They'll use that. And what happens when they have a negative experience? Are they coming back next time I go talk to them? Now, on my metrics, it looks like, look, I got this great engagement. Somebody activated a trial. But at the end of the day, when I'm thinking about the ecosystem and ecosystem health, and how do we keep an ecosystem healthy, I need to think beyond just the metric, right? I need to think about how do I provide that well-rounded experience. So that brings us to the next aspect of this, and I really enjoyed the previous talk on content, but we're going to talk about developer content. And I personally believe that developers engage with content for two primary reasons. Before I reveal them, can anybody here guess what they are? How about you? What are the two primary reasons that most developers engage with content? To fix a problem, okay, one. Yes. To what? This is perfect. You guys get it. Bingo. One is inspiration, net new, and the other one is to fix a problem. And this is one of my favorite webcomics from XKCD. I'm going to read it to some of you just because I know some people have different levels of ability to read at different speeds. But the big aspect of it is never have I felt so close to another person and yet so helplessly alone as when I Google an error and there's one result by somebody with the same problem and no answer posted in 2003. Anybody who's a developer in this audience, I see that you're laughing. And why? Because there's not a single developer that doesn't feel that pain. And so when I think about the content that I develop, there are two aspects of it. One is the net new. There's the guys who are developing, who are going to start a new project, and they want to see, has somebody already done this before? Somebody done something similar? What are the different competitive advantages of using one product versus another, one solution versus another? And the reality is, as a developer, if I see something that's already 99% implemented, and I can just change a couple lines of code for my own project, then I'm going to use that. I'm going to build on top of that. I'm going to combine it with a couple of things, and I'm going to innovate on top of that. And being able to develop content like that is very powerful. The other aspect is this, is being able to, when shit goes wrong, being able to provide avenues for people to already have the solution. Because the challenge is if I go on and I'm a developer, and I go and I search, and all I see is Denver Coder and something 2003, I have two decisions that I have to make. One is, okay, I have to use your product anyways, so I'm going to go and try to figure this out for myself, and I'm probably not likely going to share it. Or two is, I'm just going to use the competition because they have it documented better, and it's more or less the same to me. So quality content is content that inspires and unblocks developers. And I think when we talk about how to develop great inspirational technical content, there are four aspects of this. And this is a big aspect of the developer relations of DevRel. The first aspect of it is you need to be a part of your community. You can't be an outsider. You can't come in and just be, the audience person. You actually have to understand the needs of the developer community. And you have to think about it from your perspective. One of the questions that I ask myself is, okay, great. So I do a lot of NLP, deep learning. Maybe some of you guys have read my posts, maybe not. But the point is when I write or put together content, I always ask myself this question. As a member of the community, what is this one project or one tool or one thing that would be a miracle if I had it? And then I ask myself a second question. It's not, let me develop that tool. It's, why the heck doesn't that exist? And 9 out of 10 times, the reason it doesn't exist is because it's hard to do, because there are a lot of aspects of it that are blocking me. And so instead of creating it, and I try to build the content that helps close the gaps and serves as a catalyst to the community. It's similar to the old Chinese proverb cliche of teaching a man to fish versus giving him a fish, right? If I solve the problem, great, they use my new solution, maybe it only works for me. But if I solve the issues, the core issues that are blocking me from creating the problem, then when other people are looking to engage with my ecosystem or other people are looking for solutions, it also unblocks their issues. So the goal of any quality content is to make the complex feel easy. And this is, I think, my mantra for DevRel is we feel the pain so that the end developer doesn't have to. When I write something, I want the person who's reading it to feel like this is so easy that, of course, this is simple. This is the way it works. It's like how somebody feels when they go in. I don't know how many people here have used Keras, right? When somebody goes in and types import Keras or import scikit-learn, fit their model and runs a predict and is like, wow, I'm an ML engineer. Why is that such a great experience? Because that's something that's hard. It was hard implementing the backend for that Keras model. It was hard putting everything together. But now I can go online, I can figure that out, in 2 lines of code I can get ready. One of the perfect examples of that is something like object detection, which 3-4 years ago, object detection would have been something off limits to most people. Why is it an easy thing to do now? Because there are open source tools that allow me to quickly annotate my data, quickly export it. I have APIs where I can just copy and paste my output into another folder. I click a button to train a model of some code that I cloned from GitHub. I don't need to be an AI expert to get it to work. So it feels easy. It's not easy. There's a lot of iteration, a lot of crazy stuff that you have to do for production. But the point is to the end developer, I've gone through that pain, so the guy who's consuming my content makes it feel easy. And that's a big factor in getting your content consumed. So a really big example for me that I found a lot of success with this is I wrote a post on natural language processing, a 4-post series, based on the stuff that I'm doing in my degree. And the goal of the post was to take this stuff that we're reading in these deep technical articles that's not accessible to the average developer and try to make it have a developer voice so that it should, the average layman like my mom could read it and she'll get the general gist and not understand it. But pretty much any developer can read it and understand it and feel like they understand all these concepts. And it's linked to code and it's linked to examples and they can get started. And that's what moves the industry. That's what moves the ecosystem forward. And it benefits all of us because when that comes around, it means now people are using things that were very, very difficult. They're unblocked on them. So then they can build new things that are going to be difficult. We unblock those. And all of a sudden, we have a vibrant technical ecosystem and a reason for developer relations to actually exist. When it comes to actually how do I think of these ideas, I think this is one of my key, 2 of my key things that I would say is, number 1, anytime you have an idea, write it down. How do I write it down? I have 2 accounts for Medium and Dev2. Anytime I have an idea, I pull up my phone, and I just write the title of the content. Now, I might never turn that into a post. I might never turn that into anything. But I will never have a situation where I need to think of an idea because I have 20 written down already at any given time. And at any given time, this ties into what we were talking about before. I personally use a 1-week cadence for developing and releasing content. But I think it's important that at any given time, you should have at least 3 posts. One is the post that I'm writing for this week. One is the draft post for next week. And the other one is the scoped idea for 2 or more weeks out that I'm developing. This way, I click a button, and I've published my post for the week. I'm already working on the pipeline for the next week, and I already have this list of ideas that I'm fleshing out for 2 or 3 weeks out. And one of the biggest things when it comes to the actual impact that we have in DevRel is consistency. When it comes to having a developer voice that people understand or people recognize, having consistency is very, very important there. And that's why I strongly agree with you. If I could do 2 posts a week, I'd do 2 posts a week. Right now, I'm going to do 1. But if you can do 2 posts, do it. And the last aspect of this, we talked a lot about content and everything, but it's engineering. At the end of the day, we're all developers. And it's really, really important. I love this. You know, one of the funny things about Steve Ballmer is he gets a very bad rap. I don't necessarily know, and again, this is my opinion, doesn't reflect the company. I don't know how good of a CEO he was or whatever, but I will say one of the most interesting things I've ever seen was I came in when I started at Microsoft. I'd heard all these stories of this crazy guy who throws chairs and throws temper tantrums, and maybe some of it's true, but when I went into the first thing where this guy was on the stage, it's the only speaker I've ever felt where I'm in the nosebleeds and I could feel the energy of a speaker. And again, I'm not talking about Ballmer or anything, but I want to tie it back to the fact that at the end of the day, we're all developers, and we all need to be technical if we're developing our content. We need to understand that aspect. And there are 3 parts of that. One is the open source aspect of the code that we develop and we release. And here's an example of some of the repos that I've worked on over the past couple of months. You guys can check them out. And there are different types of open source content that you can develop. Some of it are workshops. So if I'm doing a workshop, for instance, I try to make it that everything in my workshop is open source, available, and wrapped up and containerized. That's a really big one. It needs to be Dockerized. Why? Because one of the biggest pain points you have when people are consuming that workshop content is going to be running it, getting all the dependencies, and people don't have time for that. The fact that it runs in a container and someone can take 1 line of code and all of a sudden be up and running, and I even put another button that does a 1-click deployment to the cloud. So if they don't have the energy or the hypervisor or whatever reason they can't run Docker locally, boom, it's already up and running in 1 click. It is an Azure plug, but what's really nice, and I think this is an important aspect of developer relations, it's true that we all represent our own companies. That's Saludo or Amazon or startups or AppsFlyer or GCP, right? But the content that we develop, we try to develop in a way that it's platform agnostic. So sure, yeah, I work for Microsoft, and sure, I'm going to use Azure as the key example of how to run everything. But everything I run doesn't necessarily have to be run in Azure. But what I find is because it's documented in Azure, because it's developed in Azure, because the thought leadership has been demonstrated in Azure, when developers engage with my content, 9 out of 10 times, they're not going to port it to AWS. They're going to run it in Azure. And the other aspect of that is even if they do port it, let them port it. That's great. I personally, and again, this doesn't reflect Microsoft, personally affects my own opinion. It's never going to be a one-horse cloud race. And I would prefer that people are spending the time porting my thought leadership to other clouds than me having to spend my time porting their thought leadership to my cloud. And so, again, it's not about who I'm plugging or whatever, but it's about making sure that we're doing what's right for the ecosystem. At the end of the day, providing solutions that minimize the friction for developers to get started off the ground, that's critical to that. So the other aspect of engineering is working directly with engineering teams. Traditionally, when I started as a technical evangelist, at Microsoft, we thought of evangelism under sales and marketing. Recently, we've undergone a shift, and it's been shifted over to engineering. And this is a really big aspect because it changes what you can do and also the impact. And one of the 2 big aspects of that is, number 1, is supporting the product team and backlog prioritization. And why is that important? Because we represent the developer ecosystem, not just the top customer. So when I think about like Microsoft in a company, right, and I think about the products that we develop, often we have tools that are used by developers all over the world. But when we're prioritizing the backlog, often that's coming from the guy who's the solution architect or the sales manager. And the reality is the needs of a Fortune 500 or a mid-sized company are not the same as the needs of the general developer or engineer. So a big part of our developer advocacy is we advocate for the developer. Or we work for our companies, and we represent the interests of our companies, and we want our companies to be successful. But we don't achieve that by shilling for our company. We achieve that by trying to do what's right for the developer in a way that's aligned with our company. And that's a big fundamental difference, and I think it's a really thing that's critical and important to Israel when we're thinking about how do we work together and how do we provide better thought leadership and better content. Because at the end of the day, if I'm developing something, and I don't know, Boaz from Amazon's developing something, and they both fit different niches, that's great. More pie for everyone. And at the end of the day, it's great for the developer community too, because there's more options, more choice, more development. And that's a big aspect of our role, is being the developer voice to the developer teams. And that's what differentiates us between just a standard content engineer or a product manager. Because at the end of the day, their role is to represent the interests of the product team, to understand what the users want, to drive their product, but not necessarily, but at the end of the day, they're beholden to the success of their product and not the success of the developer. And at the end of the day, when we look at the success or failure of platforms, it's dependent on engagement. So I'm going to put it all together with like a real world example, because I know I've been talking very high level. There are many I can choose from, but I'm going to choose one from a couple weeks ago. A couple of weeks ago, we had a conference in Israel, mostly sales and marketing conference of future of AI, a lot of thought leaders in the room. It was a decent conference, and they came to me and they asked me, can you support a demo? Can you support developing something for us? Now, what were the three things that I said are important before I go to any conference like this? I mean, again, it's great for me. You know, I get out there, people meet me, I'm swapping business cards. But the three critical things for me, and I'll go back to them, just so that we can drive the point home, because it's really, really important. Wow, we went through a lot of slides fast, huh? Bingo. Reusable presentation if I'm presenting, open source repo, online content. So what I said is, okay, I'll do this. I have an idea of a demo that I think will be interesting, inspired by something I saw in Secret Tel Aviv. But the goal is I want to make sure that what I develop is open source. I want to make sure that it inspires content that's open source. And I want to make sure that it's linked to blog posts and blog content. So what did I do? Well, let me take a step forward, and we'll go back into this. Again, next time I'll put the slide in. That's another best practice. Put the slide in next. Don't go all the way back. I'm teaching you guys as we go along. So the idea was this, is about a year ago, there was a couple really cool pictures of Tel Aviv from about 100 years ago, and somebody did manual colorization of them and uploaded it to Secret Tel Aviv. And it looked really cool to me. And I saw there are a couple machine learning models to do this using PyTorch and TensorFlow, but there's a challenge with them. These models, you can train them, and they can colorize an image, but if you want to host them on a standard, let's say, container instance, whether it's in Amazon, whether it's in Azure, whether it's in GCP, guess how much a month it will cost you in terms of memory and compute constraints, just for something that's a simple art installation? Can anyone guess? I did the calculations across all three clouds, and consistently across all three clouds, it costs somewhere between $500 to $1,000 to host and serve a model that just colorizes images. Now, it's a cool demo, but when we're thinking of like the content that we develop and how people will consume and engage with the content, that's not enough. Why would I spend $500 or $1,000 to host a site that just colorizes images? So one of the things that we've seen recently is Google released about a year ago TensorFlow.js, which enables you to run models in the browser. So instead of actually taking this model and hosting it in an expensive server-side container where I need to handle all the requests and scale out the compute for something that just colorizes images, We can take that model, we can convert it to client side, and we can run it in the browser. Great, right? Problem solved. Well, the reality is, even though TensorFlow.js framework exists, and it does enable that capabilities, the reality is it's kind of half-baked. It's not really easy to do that, and a lot of the key critical infrastructure to do something like this are missing. We'll get into that in half a second. But I think the other aspect of it is that what I started noticing is a lot of people are talking about thought leadership around TensorFlow.js and this idea, but when you look at Medium and you look at the different blog posts, about 9 out of 10 TensorFlow.js blog posts are just people taking Google's pre-made models. If Google released a model that predicts hot dog, not hot dog, they retrained that pre-made model, and now it predicts cat versus dog, or Star Wars versus Star Trek. Now that's cool, it's a nice little demo, nice little trick, but the reality is it doesn't actually, for me, contribute anything back to the community. It doesn't enable or unblock the new developers to do new different things. So what did we do here? I'm gonna give you a quick demo and walk through very easy kind of like what these concepts are. So what I did is I put together a code story, which will be released soon, that shows you how you can train a model on the cloud, what the different cost benefits are versus the different clouds in terms of training the model. Then I showed how you can convert it to TensorFlow.js and how it runs in the Daftaphon as a statically hosted app for 50 cents a month. And I also linked it to a really cool repo, collection of images from the Edith Matherson collection at the National Library of Congress in the States. And it's kind of cool, but this alone, this is something that's cool. I would pay 50 cents a month to host this, or free to host it, right? But I'm never going to pay $1,000 a month to host something like that. So that's a big aspect of it. Now what does that mean? So what had to happen behind the scenes here? Well, one of the big things is when we talk about TensorFlow.js, in TensorFlow, in order to colorize an image, I need to be able to process the image. And it's true that TensorFlow.js gives me something where it enables me to run models that I've trained in TensorFlow and run, or Keras, or different things, and run them in the browser. But what it doesn't give me is there isn't full parity for all the pre-processing libraries that I get for free in Python. So even though I have an implementation of this that works very, very well in Python, there's no way I can run it in the cloud. And all of a sudden, you start realizing why people are just making demos of hot dog, not hot dog. So one of the things that I did here is I went in, I applied this, I started looking up to see who are applications related to these types of gaps. And I implemented myself sitting through with Python and the debugger and going line by line to understand how the different tensor operations, or how the different operations behind the scene of Python are manipulating the image. And I implemented that myself in TensorFlow.js as a content contribution. Along the way, when we're talking about statically hosted apps, I noticed another interesting thing, which surprised me. You know, one of the key ways, how do people make web requests, by the way, when you're getting online content? What APIs do you guys use? Is anyone here a front-end developer? Front-end developer, going once, going twice. You're a front-end developer? Stand up. jQuery, which library in jQuery? Ajax? Okay. So Ajax is one option. You have XT something whatever, which is another option. But one of the key options that's supported in client side is the fetch API. Now, the fetch API enables me to do something that would take 10, 15 lines of code in jQuery, and it's built into native JavaScript and allows me to do it in 3. But what's the challenge is it default processes, it expects 2 formats of response from the server. One is JSON, and the other is or text. Well, what's one of the issues that we started noticing? That our blob storage API at the time only returns XML. Now, that's weird. When I talked to the product team, they're like, oh, well, yeah, we have to prioritize. We have so many new amazing features. These are the things we have to prioritize. We have to prioritize core support, distributed support, hot support, cold support, all these different aspects, but adding the aspect of a header to change from XML to JSON was something that wasn't on the priority list of them. Now it is, so it's something, but that's not enough. Okay, great, so now we fixed that, and it's something that will be coming out. But for the developer now who wants to use this service, which is a very cost-effective, affordable service, and competitive, and maybe they have credits or many reasons that they want to use the service, they wouldn't know how. It wouldn't exist. There's no sample. They'd have to figure it out for themselves. Well, what are most people going to do? What would you do? Bingo. They're going to just go to S3. Now, they had a reason. They had an incentive. Maybe there was a co-sell thing. Maybe there were other aspects like the event grid or cores or the features that Azure actually has that are differentiable. But because they can't fetch a damn blob, they're using an inferior product, right? I'm not saying that S3 is necessarily an inferior product, but for the specific things they care about, they'll take a step back because they can't fetch the blob, right? So a big aspect of this was going through and writing the sample, show how you can quickly process and do a fetch request with text, convert it, process the XML using an XPath query, and boom. Instead of now me having to figure that out for myself, I copy and paste it, right? And now, okay, that's great. How do I get that out? Well, I write a Medium post. And there are a couple aspects of the Medium post that provide me a lot of value. Number one, search engine optimization. So now when I search fetch blob storage JavaScript, even though I wrote this on April 4th, it's the first result. So the problem is solved. No one's just going to abandon the platform for that reason. Two is I can also start seeing if people are engaging with JavaScript and blob storage. Why? Because if someone's using fetch and they're using blob storage and it doesn't work, what are they going to use? S3. And now all of a sudden, when I look at the metrics of this article, I can see over time who are the people who might have gone to S3 and now they're engaging with my platform. And that's a really, really valuable thing at the end of the day when I need to say, what have I done this year? Why am I spending all this time colorizing images for a really cool history project, right? So these are the types of things that we do in DevRel. I want to conclude. I know that it's been a long night, and we're going to tie it all up. 3 things. DevRel is not the same as other developer engagement rules. 2, DevRel is about community, content, and engineering. And 3, I think it's really important that within the DevRel Israel community, we work together in Israel to define a consistent DevRel standard. So with that, I hope that's not too controversial. I'll open the floor to questions. Any questions? No? Question in the back.
When you choose one of the social medias to post your post or video or whatever, what are your consideration in choosing it?
So typically there are 2 that I look at. One is Medium and one is Dev2. Now, the reason I don't have my own blog is I did that in the past when I was a TE 5 years ago. And what I found is for most, when it comes to search engines and optimizing content and trying to find your content, it's going to be really, really hard to do that today with a new blog. If I'm Scott Hanselman, maybe I can get away with that. If I'm Jeff Bezos, maybe I can get away with that, right? If I'm somebody on the Google AI team and I have the Google AI and I'm managing the Google AI blog, maybe I can get away with posting on my own blog. But as an average developer, there are a lot of advantages. There are 2 frameworks that we look at. We look at Medium and Dev2. They have different audiences and get different levels of engagement. One of the reasons I really like Medium is when I write about a post on a subject that is under-indexed, it shoots up to it's typically the first post. So like for instance, the post I wrote about natural language processing, which, you know, there are people who are interested in that. It's a pretty niche topic. If I had written that on my own blog, maybe I'd get a couple thousand views. If I'm lucky, probably not even that. But there I have now 60,000 views. What's the other advantage of both like Medium and Dev2? is that you have publications. So I know there was like a big thing where Hacker Noon split off, but the advantage of using publications like Towards Data Science that have these huge followings that also increase, give me an added boost, is really valuable. The other thing I do is I don't just write the content, right? Writing the content's the first part. The other part is engaging and sharing it with people. And when I share the content, I'm not trying to share the content to just anyone. I try to make sure that it's relevant to the community I'm sharing for, and that I'm not spamming them. The whole purpose of developing content is not to just put content out there, because that's risky. It can do damage. The idea of putting content is getting the content in the hands of the people who it's relevant for. So there are some posts that I think are technical enough, and I'll share them in, let's say, Machine Learning, Deep Learning Israel. But I'm not going to share everything I write there, because like that JavaScript post isn't relevant. But there's another one in Azure Israel where I'm sure there are a lot of people going there to look stuff up. Maybe in a Reddit channel, or maybe on Hacker News. If it's a specific Hacker News, typically I won't do a small post like this, but the other areas that I look at are like Quora and Stack Overflow. So, sorry, long answer to a short question. Any other questions? Yes.
So you're really like a talented guy, and you're famous and whatever. But well, you're known in your area of expertise. But how do you scale, and how do you start this role in a company which is not Microsoft, that doesn't have development teams to work on your open source projects and work on your.
I think that's a big part of it, and sharing the best practices. But I also think this is why this is going to be, if we do this right, there are two things. One of two things is going to happen in the DevRel community. Either it's going to fizzle out, or if we do it right, it's going to become a standard thing, like anything, like product management or anything. We're in the early days. We're like, if you go 5 years back to those PM communities that were created by people like Shira Weinberg in Israel, like we're at those days now, right? And I think for me, my response would be is you have to make a decision. For me, I think this is a dedicated role. I think it's a role that you can, I think DevRel is a dedicated role, and it's a role that you can skill up and train, and you can search for people who have a specific background. Now, here are some of the red flags that you shouldn't look for. If somebody just comes in and says, hey, I have all this evangelism experience or whatever, that's a red flag. You know, there are certain evangelists who are great, and they have the technical role, but just because somebody has been doing this for 10 years does not mean you should listen to them. There are certain things that you want to look at. And I think you want to look for people who have these three attributes: content, community, and engineering. Now, you could take the decision and say, hey, I want my own dev team to do part of the time, write this stuff. But the difference is developer advocacy is not the same thing as documentation or writing. And there are a couple risks with that. Number one is the person within your own team who is writing the code. They won't necessarily know where do they prioritize their time. Do they prioritize their time in fixing the issues or just getting out the content? And the quality of the content might suffer. The other issue is that, and we talked about this before, is your developers are biased. I'm a developer, I'm lazy. Your developers are lazy too. But even if they're not lazy, even if they're the most productive or amazing person in the world, they're still going to have another issue, is they helped write the product. They helped engineer the product. They were in all the design meetings around the product. They know how the product is supposed to be used. So when they write the content, they're assuming that your users, your community, is going to use the content like they expected them to. And that's how you get Windows 8. Sorry. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Again, that's my opinions are my own. But these are the types of things that really, really matter, right? Self-deprecating here, right? Any other questions?
Regarding scale and what I'm doing, what I pitched for, you're doing one blog a week. How many DevRels are in Microsoft, and what is the volume? Or is there an option? Is there an option? And this is a great question, because I'll tell you why. Because it's mine. No, because if you are the only one that's posting articles for Microsoft, then it's probably not enough. And then there are developers inside Microsoft that also advocates in their own time, like at the end of at the night or the weekends. Where are they coming into discussion when it comes to developer relations in Microsoft? So what is the how is the environment of DevRel in Microsoft look like?
Said in the beginning, these are my own thoughts of DevRel, my own best practices based on how I've seen things. Like, this is how we do things in Israel, and it's been very, very successful here in comparison to, even in comparison to some of the other regions around the world. Not everybody does it the same, and people have different opinions on it. But I want to bring back to this slide is DevRel is not the only industry or the only role that's about engaging with developer audiences, but the goal of DevRel is how you engage with developer audience. And when it comes to scale, we're being strategic about the content that I write. How do I scale my content? I scale my content by thinking about what are the specific gaps, prioritizing around the gaps. I think Amir Shavat, when he was here 2 months ago, said something really interesting around this. How do they decide what content to write? They look at when he was at Slack, they would look at where are they seeing the most issues, open issues. And then what they would do is they would do something really interesting. They'd write content, but not content to just solve the issues, but they would give the guys who are writing the content complete creative control. And I think that's something we do as well. When I'm writing about, colorizing images, I have complete creative control. Where the value comes is what I choose to emphasize. It's how I take subsets of the work that I'm doing and rewrap them in things that unblock people. That's one. Number two is you can never scale your DevRel team individually. But the goal of DevRel is not to scale your individuals, not to have a guy who's flying around the entire world and speaking from conference to conference. It's not about having a guy who's writing 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 posts. The goal with DevRel is to be providing value to the community that unblocks the community and enables the community to be contributing as well. What makes something like the App Store very, very valuable? It's not just the fact that Apple released a calculator app. It's the fact that they provide the SDK and the tools and the different things. Same thing with Android, same thing. And it was one of these lessons that we learned with Windows Phone, I would say. Again, my opinion, not the company's. So I think people are tired and we're going to cut it over. But if you guys have any other questions or anything that you'd like to talk to me or ask any questions about, or we want to take this conversation further, all my contact information's in the meetup, and continue to come to these DevRel IL meetups.
אוקיי, שיהיה לילה טוב, נתראה בחודש הבא.